We have today with us Natalia Arno, the president of Free Russia Foundation. Thank you, Natalia, for being with us.
Yeah.
And I want to jump directly into the subject and to ask you, it's a big interest, and everybody is wondering here in Romania, Eastern Europe, what would be a realistic scenario in which Putin is losing power?
Well, it's very difficult to predict any scenario or to build any roadmap because we know with any long-lasting dictatorial regimes like Putin's regime or the Soviet Union or Ceausescu's regime or Bashar al-Assad regime, Arab Spring events, it was very difficult to predict. It was quite rapidly developed. What we can do, though, is to weaken the regime, to do everything so that, again, it's very difficult for the regime to navigate through mounting problems. And we see that the war, sanctions, economic problems in Russia, they're mounting for the Putin's regime. We see that there is like basically zero economic growth in Russia since the beginning of this year. It's basically entering this stagflation period. It's very difficult with the manpower. It's very difficult for Putin's regime to recruit people, both to sustain economy or to fight in the war. So we see more and more difficulties generally. And again, our main task, main goal is to just to
Yeah,
contribute
I
to
understand that.
weaken his regime from all possible angles, from and there is no silver bullet, there is no universal recipe. It
Mm.
will be again the combination of many, many factors, international pressure, internal problems, internal like their own mistakes, growing civil society, and many other things again that will contribute to the weakening of the regime, losing its credibility, losing its authority, and ultimately to some changes. And it could be either um, some liberal reforms that the government will start itself like it was before, or it will be completely transformation and transition to something different. And usually in Russia, such changes are also going on the background of some unsuccessful war efforts, like it was the
Yeah,
Crimean
it
War
happened in the past. Yeah.
in
Well, I'm
19.
here in Bucharest. You are based in Washington, D.C. because you are a member of the Russian diaspora, so to speak. But do you think, and we know from the outside that Russia has problems, economic problems, military problems, but you know what is going on in Russia. Do you think ordinary Russian citizens know what we know from the outside, that the problems are accumulating and that there will be a day of reckoning for this? Do they realize that in territories outside Moscow?
Well, it's a good question. And first of all, I would say we don't call ourselves as a diaspora because, again, diaspora is somebody who chose this path maybe, and they are trying to
Yeah, it's true.
adapt
It's true. It's
in
true.
this new home
It was
country.
not your choice to be out of Russia.
Yes, for us, it's we feel ourselves as a global Russian civil society that is now dispersed. Some people, a lot of people, stayed inside the country. Many people, like me, had to flee Russia, and we are still thinking about Russia all the time. We want like changes in our home country. We are working. We understand that our activism doesn't have any borders. It doesn't matter where we are. We still are fighting for a free and democratic Russia from any location. As for your question, I think this war has never been that popular among the Russian population. Otherwise, it would be very easy for Putin to just keep having like commercial mobilization or just general mobilization. It's like very difficult. Has to find some ways. Had to do a very disproportionate conscription from the poorest regions. First of all, it was the deliberate policy of the Kremlin to impoverish regions, and then to again to use this so-called tax on poverty and conscript anybody from all the poor regions, especially national republics, to the war. And what we see now, we see that there is this war fatigue in the society, Russian society. We see that even official polls showed that a lot of people supported the so-called peace talks, and they were very like energized, or like, yes, maybe Trump and Putin will have this deal and finally the war will be over. So I think generally people, like, again, a lot of people are silent, a lot of people are afraid, a lot of people are, of course, zombified by propaganda, but um, at the same time, I think that a lot of people also see the situation, and we see that a lot of people are oppressed, and the repressions have never been bigger since the Stalin times. We haven't seen such level of repressions for 70 years, such lengthy prison terms. So, like all this, it's quite a different situation. When even I was back in Russia, it was difficult, but at least we were able to do something, to speak out a little bit more. Now it's completely, like, I would say it's maybe top 10 or 15 most strictest and
Yeah,
dangerous regimes
absolutely,
in the
absolutely.
world.
But I'm coming back to this issue, how people think and how they calculate their plans of lives outside the big cities, so in territories where they conscript or where they enroll as volunteer militaries. And we know that the regime is compensating the families. I mean, they pay high salaries to the military, and then they relatively high salaries compared with what they have there, and they compensate the families if something happens to the soldiers. So did this, I mean, and at least for a while, it seems to be an attractive proposition to enroll the military because you get the money that you never dreamed of, right? Especially in poorer regions. But did something change in the last 3 years in the calculations of the family? I mean, do they perceive that the risk is higher and the money is probably not worth doing it?
I would say so. It was the same with the war in Afghanistan, when it seemed like, yeah, really it's some like distant operation, and like not everybody is impacted, and just some, and like, but the more people know about what's happening, the more they see dead bodies, and the more they see the what's happening. I think there is the more realization.
We are
And
already, sorry, we are already the number of victims, if I'm not mistaken, the number of wounded and deaths is several times higher than Afghanistan already in this war in Ukraine.
exactly. Though, of course, the Kremlin was smart enough not to take people from big cities, from Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other, like, but again, to take from regions, from villages. Sometimes it would be the entire village will be taken, all the male population of this or that village, remote village, will be taken. So again, those who know their rights less, those who are afraid to speak out more. And so the Kremlin was smart enough who to take to the war. But even with that, it's still like all the military budget, all this, like, still like less than 10%. And a lot of people, again, either don't see it, the war, or those, again, I would say Russia is such a different country, and we saw it when there was so-called elections. We saw again different. Some were completely like 100% falsifications. Some regions were more competitive. The same with the war. Some regions understand the war better because they impacted more these border regions like Belgorod and Kursk, of course. And some like don't even know that it's there. For them, it's like still life goes on. They still go to the
It's an
restaurant. So it's
abstraction. The war in Ukraine is an abstraction for them.
yeah. But still, I would say that with this fourth year in the full-scale invasion, more war fatigue, more people learn about it, more they don't like it, and more people want to stop it.
Mhm. So, what do you think if the current American plan is succeeding, which is equivalent to a surrendering of Ukraine? So, in a way or another, let's suppose they freeze or close this conflict. Do you think in a period of time Putin will move against a NATO country after that?
It's very likely, and I think it's very important for any Western commentator to uh, closely watch what they discuss on the Kremlin television. And usually they tell about their plans. Putin himself, Lavrov, Medvedev, and so on. They were saying, and if we were more attentive to their words, we were maybe more prepared. And the justification is the same that they used about Ukraine. They now speak about Ukraine much less. They are now speaking about like Russian Empire, restoring Russian Empire more. They already saying about like parts of Romania being like a part of Russian Empire, or Baltic countries,
Yeah, we
or
noticed that. Huh.
Moldova, or Finland, yes, or Warsaw and things like that. So much more narratives about that. How again it's just restoring our like so-called historic lands and so on. And especially if there is a big succession on Ukraine, especially if the US legitimizes and signs it, and of course Putin will be even more emboldened to attack the NATO countries on the eastern flank, especially vulnerable countries like the Baltic countries and Moldova. And it's very, very likely, of course. And this is what they're discussing on the Kremlin television at the moment, like
So do you
much
think
more.
your interpretation is that such language, which we saw before the escalation in Ukraine in 2022, so is this a priming of the Russian population for the next stage?
This is usually what they do. They have a very big disinformation campaign, noise campaign, everything else. They start like discussing that. It was about absolutely any move that they start like when there is like abolishment of the terms, presidential terms. There is like so like called Valentina Tereshkova asking Putin to continue, or when there is like an attack on foreign NGOs, on Russian civil society, there is always like some campaign discrediting and things like that. And the same was with the war, with the invasion to Ukraine, both times in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, and later with the full-scale invasion. At first there is a big noise, they all discuss it, they all like prepare that, and then they act. The same now, yes, they are now doing this first step of discussing this, restoring Russian lands, Russian Empire.
Yeah. So suppose something happens to Putin. What do you think is more likely scenario after Putin? Will we have a second Putin or a typical period of chaos, which is, it happened historically in Russia, or a fragmentation, territorial clans, or can we have a transition to democracy in Russia? I mean, is there enough society, infrastructure, civil society, leaders to shepherd a transition to democracy?
Thank you
So
for the
what's
question.
more likely to happen?
Yes, this is what we are working on, and of course, it's
I know
difficult.
you are working for the last
Yes,
option,
and we
but
are working on the last option, understanding that it's when there is a second attempt, it's always chances that it will be more successful. And we had some kind of some uh, resemblance of democratic change back in the 90s, very chaotic and not lasting and everything else. But at least people already learned what democracy is, what it can be with freedom of speech, with other things, economic freedoms and so on. And we hope that when there is a window of opportunity for us, we'll be able, and that's why it's our homework to prepare. Of course, we are trying to get there. And I would say that here, what is a more realistic scenario is a stronger civil society, is a more horizontal, bottom-up demand for democracy, which always existed. Like Russia is not that different from any other country. It's maybe more suppressed very often, but again, the demand is there. And if there was no like bottom-up demand for change during perestroika times, we probably will still have a Soviet Union in some like cosmetic renovation maybe, and that's it. And we know that as soon as there is some competition, some opening, people would like to have a say. They want to like when there is an election without any good candidates, there is very low turnout. When there is a competition, like there was in Khabarovsk with Furgal, or Ekaterinburg with Roizman, or with any other like municipal even, the people would come and would try to participate. It's more interesting. They really would like, and that's maybe why the Kremlin was trying to imitate the facade of democracy, trying to imitate the so-called elections, spend so much money on even fake candidates just to pretend there is some competition. So I think they understand that again there is a demand for that,
yeah,
and
democracy still has a value, even as a window dress for the
even
regime.
even yes for that. And I would bet less on the Russian elite. I think they're very loyal. They're very not very brave. They are I would say, and their internal conflicts are not that fundamental, that important. And I would more bet on civil society, on strengthening. And this was the main attack of the Soviet regime and on Putin's regime to atomize the society, to atomize people. And but we still see that civil society exists. That there are a lot of people that are doing a lot of good things. They are saying in country activists, they are saying we are not building bridges now, we are digging tunnels, but it's a lot of tunnels, and it's very important to save this network for us of people, and any collective action is dangerous for the Kremlin. Anything that
Okay,
people.
so you think there is hope, especially in the regions, and we've seen from time to time, even now with this war in Ukraine, unrest in Russian regions, or even conflicts between these strange elites, Kadyrov versus someone else, even open conflicts. So, is there any chance to have a second Prigozhin revolt, or a successful one, or a more civic-oriented one, somewhere in Siberia? I don't know.
I would say more civic, probably more likely. Prigozhin is not a very telling situation. He was never an outcast. He was always like inside the system. What was um, surprising about Prigozhin's revolt was how the system was paralyzed and how it didn't
Exactly.
like
Very,
and
very brittle. It conveyed the sensation that they are like glass, very hard but fickle.
Yes, yes, and then yes, it's not that solid. Putin's power not that solid and not that like mighty and all that. And at the same time, with some glimpse of like a future, if it happens with Putin, like now nobody remembers about Prigozhin that much, and probably like they would say, okay, no Putin, okay, yeah, and I would say again like less. Bad or less things that the elite will do something and there will be some and again Kadyrov and the Karimov conflict just proved that Putin still controls the elites, and it's still Kadyrov tried to to um, contest that deal, but at the end he failed, and at the end everything went how Putin approved it. So it's only telling that again, like the
Yeah.
elite is being controlled by the regime, and uh, I would bet more on civil society, on regional. Um, Regional unrest, civic unrest, but at the same time, I don't believe in too much of fragmentation of the country. There is no such a demand. There is a big demand for federalization and a real democratization of the country. Russian Federation is such a Potemkin village. It has never been a federation. It's always like a unitary state controlled from Moscow by Moscow and so on. And what the regions want is like more autonomy, more like again ability to economically decide their future and things like that. But
They used to have, the regions, the oblast used to have some autonomy before Putin. So in the
right,
90s, there was real elections for in the regions which Putin abolished, actually.
right, exactly. And when in the 90s there was more like more separatism and more regional autonomy, that much with tariffs, with like it, people didn't like it that much, and Putin was able to capitalize on it,
Mm.
saying again like integral Russia, like united bigger Russia, like um, and also the composition of Russia is different now. While it's not only 11 time country zone or 80 plus region country, it's also a country with 190 ethnic minorities. At the same time, it's quite homogeneous because uh, at the like when there was the collapse of the Soviet Union, when there was a collapse of the Tsarist Empire, it was 40% were like Slavic Russians. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, 50%. Now it's 80%. It's even more like
It's more homogeneous
more
ethnically, yeah.
homogeneous, yes. But of course, there is a demand from especially national republics for more autonomy, for more like for more respect of culture, identity. It's the same as Putin's Russia was denying Ukraine of its identity, sovereignty, language, everything else. The same way it's the
Yeah.
Putin's regime is denying
Actually,
all others.
ethnic homogeneity doesn't contradict local autonomy, regional autonomy. Look at Poland, which is very homogeneous, but you have a lot of decent local autonomy there. So
Or
it might be a
Canada or any
model for
other,
Russia.
yes, democratic countries, of course. And this is what I think Russians want is to have real federation, to have like real democracy and real regional powers, municipal, very strong local self-government, and then things like that. So this is like the
Mm.
real demand, and this is how it should be transformed. And our diversity could be our strength with checks and balances and everything else. And this is what we are working on again, writing out like how the country can be transformed.
Yeah. So,
But,
and I want to conclude now with a sensitive question of collective responsibility, which many nations have to confront at some point in their history. And now is a it's again the turn of Russia, and we have a 3-year war. And how is this? I'm not asking your position on that, but how is this reflecting in the discussions in the community of the emigres or at home? So, what is the stage of this discussion? Is there any conclusion whether there should be a collective responsibility for this war or for the imperial past of Russia, or is a buried topic and nobody discussing it?
well, inside Russia, censorship and repressions are limitations to discuss all that.
Of course.
But in our exiled communities, of course, we discuss it more. And when Russia, like it's possible, Russia opens up, and if the situation is different, of course, there will be more debates on that. And we, of course, start these debates from the being the voice for the voiceless, being in exile. Of course, we understand, we would differentiate between collective guilt and collective responsibility. We, of course, understand that we we are the first victims of Putin's regime, and that internal aggression led to internal repression led to external aggression, and that we were the first ones to warn the world about the danger of Putin's regime. But also, we are the agents of change, and we are the ones. Only Russians can change the situation in Russia. It won't be Americans, or it won't be Martians, aliens. It will be Russians. And we understand that again, this war is on the behalf of the entire nation and all of us, and we understand that again. We have to pay all the retributions to Ukraine. We have to, of course, and this was our biggest mistake and biggest problem. Why Putin and everything else like was possible, because we didn't, as a society, didn't contemplate of all the crimes of the communist regime, of the Soviet Union
Yeah.
past and all that. Of course, we'll have to go through that as a society. Of course, it's very important. We understand that. We also like preparing, we are studying the experience of all other countries who went through that. But of course, it's without that, we won't be able to change the country for real. And of course, it's like a very important topic for us. We understand that, yeah.
How do you differentiate? You made a distinction between collective responsibility and collective guilt. It looks like an interesting notion, actually. What is the difference between them, and what would be the practical consequences of that?
Well, collective guilt is something which is very beneficial for the Kremlin to say, because each crime has like real people, real perpetrators, real like masterminds, and you cannot say that people are uh, guilty the same way. Like Vladimir Karamurza, who always fought against Putin's regime, who was poisoned twice, who was imprisoned to 25 years, Stalin era sentence. That it's the same guilty as I don't know, Lavrov and things like that. And of course, and or you cannot say that it's not the guilt of the West, who was appeasing Putin, who was given like again helping with army of like lobbyists and lawyers and bankers and like all making the regime stronger, saying like, oh, it's all just a commercial deal, Nord Stream 2, for example, and things like that. So it's just unfair and it's not right. And all the crime should have its punishment, should have its accountability and justice. But as for responsibility, as again, as Russians, as uh, being from the country aggressor, of course, we understand that we need to deal with that consequences of that aggression. Of course, we are indebted to Ukraine forever. We have to pay all the retributions. We have to go through all this international justice mechanism and things like that. So it's important to like, otherwise again we don't have any future as a nation, as a country.
Yeah. This is indeed a very sensitive topic, and thank you for this honest answer. And I think we should conclude here. And I thank you very much for taking part
Yeah,
in our
much
short
inviting.
discussion, and hope to see you again in better times.
Thank you.
Good luck in Washington, D.C. with your work.
But yes, thank you. I need that.
Thank you very
Thank
much again, Natalia.
you. Bye.